Okay,
Right now it's pointing here.
we are live, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. Um, and tonight's topic is we are starting on, we're talking on the history of the Toltecs. We're going to be talking about things that are both actual historical fact, um, blending into the mythological, blending into oral tradition, trying to make sense out of the historians' lack of ability to figure out who the Toltecs were.
It popped up in your Oh, here we go. There you go.
So, that said, these books right here are some of what we're going to be talking about, but now they have to go away. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
I haven't seen you in ages. It's been hours.
So last weekend.
Yeah, that is. It's like last weekend, like last
4 hours
millennium.
ago.
Yeah. As you know, we are studying Toltec philosophies and Toltec energy and Toltec knowledge. And at some point, I knew we'd get to this point, which is what the heck is a Toltec? The discussions we've had so far, both before we started broadcasting and the ones since we started broadcasting, have been focusing more on Toltec consciousness work, Toltec philosophies, what it is that how we view the universe uniquely different than others. Now, what we're going to go into is a little bit more of a lengthy discussion on who we are. Who are we who claim to be Toltecs, and what does history say about them? So my intent, my desire is that this is a discussion, not a lecture. So please ask lots of questions, and we'll have a conversation, a multi-way conversation. So I'm going to give a really brief overview of the lack of agreement among historians. Somewhere in here, we will have a conversation about the strengths and limitations of modern academia. So historians today claim the Toltecs were a culture that lasted somewhere around 150 to 200 years, from starting somewhere around 900 to 1000 AD, running up till somewhere into the mid to late 1100s. Some might even go into the 1200s. And they were this big, evil, horrible race of people who conquered their neighbors and engaged in human sacrifice. And they're evil, so we don't talk about the Toltecs. That's one school of thought from history. There are, however, a lot of discrepancies in what historians say. They say, oh, well, the first Toltec king was an incarnation of Quetzalcoatl, the winged god, and that was back in 500 BC. So clearly there's a big gap in time. And there's other indigenous cultures in the Mesoamerican area that are often being confused with the Toltecs. So number one on the list is the Mayans. There's some others that are reputed to have had a relationship with the Toltecs, like the Olmecs, the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs, and they all had their little areas around there, and they all claim to have something to do with the Toltecs. So they have divided the Mayan culture, for example, up into three main segments called, and you have to forgive scientists, sometimes we're not the most creative people, the early, the middle, and the late Mayan periods. So at different times, both the Mayans and the Aztecs claimed to have gotten all their knowledge and all their wisdom and their art, their architecture, all those abilities had come from the Toltecs. The Toltecs were revered as this great culture who knew everything. And not unlike the way the Romans viewed the Greeks, as has been pointed out by some of my teachers. Yet none of it really matches. You can't pick up one book on history and say, here's who the Toltecs were, here's their timeline, here's where they were at, and then pick up the next book, and then the next one, and have any two books agree on any point related to the Toltecs. It just can't be done. Historians like written records, and anything that isn't historical with a written record that was notarized and stamped with a seal and filed in triplicate and all the file cabinets, you know, which of course didn't exist back then. But they're looking for all of that when they go and view history. And if they don't have that, oh, well, then it's rumor, it's mythology, it's oral tradition, we don't go there. And so it's mythology, we really don't go there if you're a historian. And that's some of the problems we face if we want to know who are the Toltecs, who were the Toltecs back then. And please, don't annoy the historians by telling them that, well, the cities died and faded and people dispersed, that the caste that held the knowledge went into hiding underground and there's a 1,000-year-long oral tradition. Because that would just, you'd see steam coming out and they would shut down. So we don't want to annoy the historians. Same way when we go to the zoo, we don't poke and jab animals through the cage bars. So we don't annoy the historians by telling them that. Okay, that just wouldn't be fun. So I have the advantage of having trained with a very wise Toltec shaman who trained with another very wise Toltec shaman, and so on. We have an oral history. We have a tradition that goes back many, many, many generations. I won't even say how many. I don't think even Coyote or Cachorro knows exactly, but thousands of years, this lineage. It goes back to the time before there were Toltecs, this lineage, this priesthood caste that held this knowledge. So I'm going to kind of do an end run, and I'm going to give you an overview of some of what the oral tradition is. And feel free to ask the questions I'm encouraging you all to ask or offer comments at any time. According to the oral tradition, the culture we now know as the Toltecs got its start somewhere around 500 BC. It developed and moved forward, and then it finally ended somewhere in the late 900s AD. The ending came up, but we know a little bit more about the ending than we do about the beginning. So I'm going to kind of work backwards through some of this. The ending came during a time of environmental disaster. And there were droughts, there was no food, there was no water, people were upset, their children were dying, understandably. And the king at the time, the Toltec king, was someone named Se-Acatl, which name means one reed. And his answer, he was the secular king as well as the head of the priesthood, and his answer was to pray more, to meditate more, to try and commune with the gods and the universe and figure out what was going on wrong and bring the proper forces to bear on fixing these worldly problems, which were very real. And it was appearing not to work. The rains didn't come, people were still starving, and so forth. There was a competing priest by the name of Tezcatlipoca, which means smoking mirror or the smoked mirror. And His answer was, like Darth Vader, to go to the dark side. And he instituted some human sacrifice. And for a short time, it appeared to work. The rain came back, people were happy. They said, enough with this Sayakotl guy, and he was driven out. Some of the histories will say, oh, he voluntarily left. Probably not. He probably was encouraged to leave. When he left, those who were in the know knew what was happening. They said, okay, that's black magic, that's not good, we're leaving. And yes, they were being driven out and forced into exile, and they couldn't get the people to listen. So what happened was Sayakotl took most of the aristocracy and the priesthood caste who knew about the power that we call the Akadwa, who had the higher levels of knowledge, who had the secret keys to how to unlock the universe. And they left, and part of the plan was he told his people to go in all different directions and take their knowledge and keep practicing it and keep it secret and keep it safe and hide and blend in with whatever culture they happen to settle in, and to keep doing that forward in time. There were prophecies then that the Toltec knowledge would be needed towards the end of the next great cycle, which was going to end in more than 1,000 years later. So you went into this culture knowing that the work you were doing wasn't going to see the light of day for 1,000 years. And that great cycle on the Mayan calendar, which they had borrowed from the Toltecs, and now it's called the Mayan calendar, predicted that great cycle to end in 2012. So according to the rest of the world, nothing happened in 2012. But if you look at what was going on then compared to now, and look at how radically our world has changed, I think something's going on. So Sayakotl did that. He spread his people. They went in all directions. He appears to have settled in the Yucatan, near what is now known as Chichen Itza. One of the things in the book over here called Ancient Kingdoms of Mexico and some of the others that I'm talking about, everybody has noticed the great similarity between some of the architecture in Tula and at Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza. And so I was reading recently a variety of different theories. Well, how could this have happened? Maybe the Toltecs conquered Chichen Itza and the culture there and built the pyramids. Maybe Chichen Itza conquered Teotihuacan and built those pyramids. And well, maybe they just settled there and took their knowledge. Now they're getting closer. The oral tradition states that yes, they moved part of the Toltec class that left. They moved out into the Yucatan and they settled near what is now Chichen Itza, and they built the pyramid. We'll come back to how fast they may have built that and what that might have meant about the technology they really held another day. We're not going to talk about that today because we won't have time. So the problem with history is they don't like oral traditions. They don't like complicated answers. They like easy answers. And most people are like that. We like things to be simple and neat, and seldom is the world simple and neat. It's my personal opinion that the biggest thing that confuses the world about the Toltecs is the fact that they are not one tribe. There wasn't one genetic race called the Toltecs. There is Mayans, there were Aztecs, there were Zapotecs, and so forth. But there wasn't the same situation with the Toltecs. The Toltecs was a deliberately and intentionally created society that included people from all over. And by all over, I mean multiple continents, not just multiple neighborhoods in Mesoamerica. And we'll come back to that either tonight or next time also. There's a great deal of archaeological evidence as well as DNA evidence in support of the fact that there were people from all over the world in Mesoamerica in that time frame. The problem with historians, other than they only look at written records, is the modern world of academia, and I'm not going to just single out historians, I'm going to single out everyone in an academic department at a university doesn't talk to anybody else in other departments, for the most part. You know, you're a geologist, you're walking down the hall, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Bodensteiner, we heard that you were seen at the cafeteria yesterday actually talking to an archaeologist. Is that true? Well, I didn't mean to. And the archaeologists get in trouble for talking to the geologists. And none of them talk to the anthropologists, and none of them talk to the linguists, and none of them talk to the art historians, because we have real history, and then there's this art stuff over here on the side. And yeah, that was just decoration, but here's the history. And little do they know, like especially for the Mayans, the art is the history. The art is the history. The art is the writing. So if you ignore the art, you ignore the history. Now, just to make things confusing, the Toltecs are known to have left very little, if any, writing. They only left the artwork. So that really confounds historians. They are viewed as a prehistoric culture, or the cultures in the time frame we're talking about, that roughly 500 BC to 1000 AD time frame. They view that as prehistory. And they find evidence in archaeology, well, maybe they were trading. They traded here, 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 here. And they go on. But it's interesting because you learn so much when you start comparing, and you have to look at a lot of different areas to get a whole story. One of the other things that really confounded the Europeans when they first arrived in Mesoamerica and Mexico was when they discovered the city of Tula. They found the pyramid that has all the really cool statues on it, and they asked the locals, well, who are these statues of? And they were told, oh, well, that's the Atlanteans. Atlanteans? If, you know, somebody probably knew that that was just a myth that Plato had created. So what are we calling, they thought somebody had found out about it and was saying that just to annoy and confound the Spanish, and that wasn't the case. It wasn't the case at all. No, that was Atlantean. Well, why would you have statues of the Atlanteans? Well, that's where we came from. You know, our ancestors came from there. Well, what is Atlantis? Oh, it was this island out here in the big ocean, and it sank, and the people came here in canoes or on the backs of turtles, or however they got across the water. And, you know, nobody had heard of that before. So one of the books I have here is called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by a man named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly is one of the people who was a congressman from Minnesota. And back in the late 1800s, he was in Washington, D.C. with apparently way too much time on his hands. Then and now, politicians appear not to have worked very hard. But thank goodness he spent all his spare time in the Library of Congress. What he did was he reviewed literature where he looked at the writings we had from in the anthropology and the archaeology and the geology and the biology from people all around the Atlantic Ocean who said the same myth. Our ancestors came from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on an island that sank. It was called Atlantis or Atlanta or Atlantin or Atalanta or some...
Aztlan.
Yeah, Atlan, various names like that, where, you know, a letter or two here or there, they're saying the same name with a description of the same kind of place. And no matter where you are in North America, South America, Africa, or Europe, if you draw a map and you point an arrow from where that people there said they came from, all those arrows would converge right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You know, that's not over there, it's over there. And that's what the oral traditions said. That's what some of the writings said. And Donnelly, as far as I'm aware, did the first serious academic work to look at this myth, quote unquote, of Atlantis, which to this day, what time is it? This very moment, modern history does not recognize the existence that there was ever a continent named Atlantis. It may very well be there wasn't, but if we were in a courtroom using the standard of preponderance of evidence, which you use in civil trial, it'd be slam dunked. Move on to the next case. Yeah, Atlantis existed. Go away. Look at all the pyramids we're finding on the bottom of the ocean. Look at all this other evidence. You know, go through his book. And all the people who object to the idea of Atlantis having existed, I've never heard one of the objectors even discuss this book. They don't even acknowledge that it exists. And if you haven't read it, it's an interesting read. If history and archaeology and the true history of the earth is important to you. So I guess that begs the question then, why would we care? Why do we care about the true history of the earth?
To know ourselves better, right?
To know yourself better, that's part of it.
To know our ancestors, yeah, where we came from.
Truth, we want the truth.
You want the truth, you want to know your ancestors, you want to know where you came from.
Our potential, where we.
Oh, I like that.
What we lost.
She sat right across from me and she has a profound answer.
Thank you.
Our true potential. Because when you start to look at all the myths, in that time, Atlantis is reputed to have a huge amount of technology, a huge amount of things that we don't. And when it fell, and I don't even want to get into the dates and the timing of that, but it appears to be somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago, which, admit it, is a very big period of time. I'm thinking it's closer to the 15 than the 12, at least that's my personal opinion. Again, based on a lot of different things I've read. But there are no slam dunk answers. There's some geological evidence that gives one date, well then this is when that big flood thing happened, and oh, here's where this other cataclysm happened. And there doesn't have to have only been one cataclysm. So that's where one of the confounding things. But this idea, we make all these movies like Mad Max and about these futuristic, quote unquote, post-apocalyptic societies. Oh, when things go to heck in a handbasket, what's it going to be like? Don't look now. But we are actually living in a post-apocalyptic society. We are still trying to regain knowledge and regain abilities that we collectively had as a human race some 15,000 years ago. It was hard for me at first to really understand why there is so much resistance in academia to certain things being true. And they fight like the Dickens to make sure nobody goes there with respect to Atlantis, and whether it was ancient aliens or not, I don't know, but ancient technologies, what we're truly capable of. They don't want to talk about any kind of pre-Columbian transatlantic travel when the evidence is, again, overwhelming. The Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Templars,
Well, they definitely don't even want to talk about the Vikings and
Oh,
the
that
Templars
was one.
being there in 700 AD, you know, And there's tons of evidence of that. So in mythologies and stuff in Iceland and Greenland and so
There's a whole swath from like eastern Canada all the way to Minnesota of evidence. Of
runic
them
writings.
making them that far, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like the Newport Tower, Rhode Island, is very clearly a Templar Knight built tower. It was there when the white people first got here. Well, no, it wasn't. It was when the late arrivals got there and found it. It was there in Rhode Island, but it was clearly built by the Templar Knights back in the 1300s, because that's when they left. And there's other reading we can talk about another day to document the history of the Templar Knights in North America. It's really interesting to wonder why that is the case. Why is history fighting so hard? And by history, I mean the professional history cult, if you will, of academicians who appear to have the mandate to find the truth and then go to great lengths to cover it up. That's another story for another day, maybe. But it certainly plays a part when you start looking at Toltec history. Did you have a question?
I guess it's a comment because it's there seems to be a definite we don't go there attitude to the current academic way of looking at these things. But there also seems to be a clear cover up all the way along. I mean, I think probably the church had a lot to do with that because they didn't want us to be thinking about anything outside of the biblical timeline. And then I think through Christianity, we've kind of perpetuated that where, okay, this is the accepted timeline because it goes along well with the Bible. But quite frankly, we're missing a huge chunk, 4,000 to 6,000 years prior to that where there's nothing. It just got wiped out, whether it was floods or glaciers or comets or whatever you want to call it. Something took a huge chunk out of our history, and so we just don't go there either.
Right.
Except for I'm an art historian, and we find stuff. Not very much, but we find stuff like the goddess worshipping cultures that were in there. The oldest architectural building that we have still is Jericho, which is dated at 9,000 BC. So that's in that period where everything else got wiped out, but there's these few things. So it's not like people didn't hang out at that point.
Right. And what you said about the gaps, right? There's huge gaps, not just that 4,000 to 6,000 years ago gap. Between roughly 15,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago, there's very little in the archaeological record. They occasionally now, I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, found something that they're dating to 30 to 40,000 years ago. And some of them are a lot more advanced than they expect for that time frame, because that completely defies the humankind developed 15,000 years ago from mute cavemen. And that just doesn't fly. I mean, we have written records in China and India that are almost that old, that talk about advanced cultures that predated them by eons. So the cover-up with respect to the Toltecs is interesting. And I'm starting to conclude with even just a small amount of time I've been devoting to this research recently. I'm starting to realize that there has been a cover-up with the Toltecs. The cover-up has been everything prior to the roughly 900s is written off. They don't consider that Teotihuacan and Tula and several of the other major cities in the area were all Toltec. And we're now calling, oh, well, that was the early Mayan, that was the pre-early Mayan, or that was the Aztecs, or the late, early, mid, pre-Aztecs, whatever. They assign things that were Toltec somewhere else. They don't seem to trace through the art very much. And they clearly aren't listening to the oral tradition. Again, the Toltecs weren't a genetic race, so if they're basing their findings on DNA from, oh, these people related to here, 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 and we don't look at this city because they have DNA from everywhere, so we don't go there, right? So I don't know if that's what they're doing, but I could see that happening. but something is driving them away. Now, when you read the oldest references, things written roughly prior to 1950, they talk about the Toltecs. Oh, it went from here to here. They look at the almost the full timeline. They get a lot of the stories and the legends right, especially about Sayacatl and Quetzalcoatl, and this city was Toltec, that city was Toltec. But since then, the quote unquote more modern writings, the more modern textbooks, anything published in the last, especially 30 years, no, they don't talk about it. Oh no, that's all early Mayan. Oh no, that's all mid Mayan. They don't talk about anything Toltec prior to the point where Sayacatl was driven out.
And so that's where what we do have in the legends that say Sayacatl was the last Toltec king. And yet the academics' story about the Toltec begin with the exile of Sayacatl. So what they're lumping into is after the fall of the Toltec Empire. That's what, with the remnant of that, who became very warlike and doing sacrifices and stuff. That seems to be what their academics are calling the Toltec era, which is clearly after the fall of it.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's such a good point, because how can you have the beginning of a culture start after the fall of the last king of that culture? Makes no sense. So I don't have an answer for that. I was hoping some of you guys would have answers.
Conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it's the ancient aliens, and
Well, I was wondering if it was, if they were only doing an oral tradition and they were keeping things in secret and they weren't distributing power until someone earned it through,
Mhm.
what they learned, or maybe going through. I wonder if it could be like other secret societies that are, linked to the geometry of the streets of Washington D.C. and London and stuff, and if our culture were to be all of a sudden decimated, like some other continent showed up and just raped and murdered us and took all of our resources, would they be looking at the history and saying, well, there was some other culture, they weren't Americans, they were this group that apparently controlled America from behind the scenes, like in the shadow, like let's say 1,000 years from now, we might find that the Trilateral Commission actually is what's making all the decisions for the United States and our military-industrial complex, and they'll be looking at that more closely or something. Right?
You don't know. Maybe, yeah. I mean, you don't have to wait 1,000 years to find out some of that is true. Go ahead.
My thinking at this point has been along the lines of this race, this version 2.5 or whatever we are, we have had to evolve until we were at a point where we could be receptive to the energies in at least part of the formula.
Yes, that's part of it.
And it just sort of works together in synergy as we continue to.
Yeah, I mean, we clearly had it once.
Yeah.
And we lost it. Some of what you will read says, oh, this is those memories. We've been blocked by God from memories of that because we messed up hugely. Blowing up continents, killing lots of people is generally viewed as a bad thing, pretty much everywhere. So yeah, in one hand, I think we are trying to prove worthy, and on the other hand, I sometimes wonder about the fact that, okay, we had it, we lost it, we're trying to get it back. One analogy in culture you always say is, we'll follow the money. But kind of a corollary to that would be, who stands to benefit from us not getting that? And are we being a modern victim of modern social engineering and brainwashing techniques to keep us from that?
Absolutely. I believe
I've
that.
got a
And-
consensus
And
on that one.
No, I mean, that's
And-
part of my worldview.
Yeah, and so I don't wanna necessarily turn this into a huge conspiracy theory
No.
discussion.
I think this is
I'm-
where
I'm-
discernment comes in.
Yeah,
You know,
So-
for each of us, judgment. and-
on the one hand, I tend to believe that, you know, I didn't start out to become a conspiracy theorist, I just followed the facts, and
Kind of,
they point where they lead.
Yeah.
And so I'm not from that standpoint, I'm not a wild conspiracy theorist, I'm more of a conspiracy factist, and let's assume, for the sake of argument, that all of these conspiracies are true.
or contain nuggets.
Now what?
Yeah.
100% correct, here you go, here's the tray, all the conspiracy theories are on there and they're all true. Now what are we gonna do? That's the practical question. It's like, what do we do? Well, one of the conspiracies is that through television and frequencies and cell towers, they have multiplexed into them signals that keep people from waking up. They combine with the fluoride in the water and the this and the that and the other thing. So how do you get people awake to do something about this when they're either being controlled or dumbed down through chemical means or otherwise, brainwashing daily in schools and media? What do we do about that?
Wake up and shine.
That's part of it.
Certainly, I mean, but it kind of all sort of condenses into that.
Yeah.
For me, right now.
One thing you've said a lot is that, you know, they have a vested interest in making sure that you don't think that you can talk directly to God.
Right.
And so I think that,
That's
know,
the
it-
church.
yeah, if you want to go and talk to the church,
A lot of
and I
people,
think
right.
that could be part of the reason why they would want to suppress Toltec knowledge is because,
We're teaching you how to talk to God.
yeah, you mean you
Partly.
a lot of the legends that, from what I understand, or I've heard, that there were people who could do things like Christ, and the church does not want you to think that you can do anything like Christ could have done.
Well, yeah, I know. I mean, I've run into people throughout my life who attend churches where they told them, don't read the Bible, you'll just be confused, just do what we tell us, and then what they're telling is directly opposite the Bible. And it says in the Bible, the words of Christ in the book of John, everything I can do, you can do better, in the nutshell. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth in me, the things that I do shall he do also, and even greater things than these shall he do. That's what Christ said about that. So if any Christian church tells you otherwise, just show them that quote and say, I won't be back to your Christian church. Thank you very much.
And he actually read in there quotes from an Old Testament verse, Psalms or Proverbs somewhere.
Yeah.
Where it says, and he says, don't your own scriptures tell you ye are gods?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's whatever is between us and our full potential.
Right. So
I don't
There-
believe
there
the power
is-
needs an intermediary.
right. So if all the conspiracies are true, now what? What do we do about that? And what the Toltecs are doing about that is contained right in the name of the city of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan, historians say, oh, that's the city of the gods. It was made by the gods. Oh, we'll just stand back and look. But no, that's not what the name means. The name means the city where gods are made. Sometimes translated as the city where gods are forged. I like the word forged because I use that forging process as an analogy for the alchemical process we do inside.
Yeah.
So you went there for spiritual work and spiritual transformation to become like Christ, to become like the gods, get trained in those godlike abilities, which according to Scripture, we all have that potential to become. There's another less known facet about the Toltecs, going back further in time. I told you I was working back. The Toltecs, the name in the Nahuatl language Nahuatl, I wish I knew how to pronounce that, and it's a beautiful language, I wish I could speak it. I'll have to study it. The name Toltec means master craftsman or master builder or master artisan.
I like that.
In the last week, I've read all 3 of those translations in different words. And according to the oral tradition of our lineage, the Toltec caste was not always the ruling caste. They were the secret guys and gals in the corner who held the secret fancy knowledge and knew stuff and knew how to do stuff and knew how to make the art and they knew how to make the buildings. They knew how to build the pyramids. So they were like the class of secret sacred architects and artists within a culture.
You know, it kind of reminds me of the Templars and the Freemasons in the era, you know, of the church and everything's being controlled that way, and yet all of the beautiful cathedrals and castles were built by Freemasons, and that's why they're called free, because they earned their freedom and they weren't vassals of the king or the state or the Pope even, and that's why they got exterminated, is because they, you know, had the knowledge on the architecture and how to build, so they were craftsmen, but they were not the kings, they were not the ruling class, but they still had the knowledge.
There are a lot of parallels which we can talk about 1 or 2 times down the road between the Templars and their descendants, the Masons, and the Toltecs. And when we go back to those early times, it becomes obvious that there was a lot more transatlantic travel than historians admit, right? We'll come back to that. But where I'm going with this is some of the oral legends of the Toltecs say that they weren't just concentrated in that region where they were near the end of the culture in Mesoamerica. They weren't just there. They had spread very far north through North America. And so as I'm piecing these together, both in writings and in meditation and things of that nature, talking to Coyote at times, it seems clear that this culture had spread far north. The Toltecs were there, they were part of it. They weren't necessarily the ruling class. You didn't necessarily call the civilization the Toltecs at that point. That would be like saying, you know, like in your example, oh, well, the French were the Knights Templars because the founding Knights Templars came from what is now southern France. No, they were a group within a country. And it appears that that's what the Toltecs were doing. And it wasn't until much later, after having spread north and then appearing to come back down south, I'm of the opinion that after that period of northern expansion, that the culture came south because things were falling apart, whether it was due to wars or environmental issues or what have you. And then later on, the Toltec caste actually became the ruling caste at some point, and I don't know yet when that was. But that appears to be another piece of the equation, which of course historians are gonna, they won't go there.
One of the references that I was reading was saying, oh, well, yeah, there's these cities of Tula and Teotihuacan and so forth that are different, that we think, you know, the Toltecs were at. But compared to the Mayan, they were such a small group that the best we can say is that they were some random little kingdom. But you see again how they discount the culture of the Toltec because they were small in comparison to this bigger culture. but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist or that they didn't hold those cities or that their art and culture didn't flourish there. And so there's this tendency to minimize things. So like when I one of the last American history classes that I took, you know, they launch right into Christopher Columbus, and I'm like, you know, well, what about, you know, well, first of all, what about the Native Americans that were here first? And second of all, what about the Vikings? And essentially, I was, you know, told to sit down, shut up, and be good, you know. But essentially, he was saying that, oh well, you know, the Vikings didn't settle America. Okay, well, that's a kind of a technicality, isn't it? It's like they were here, they made an impact, and whether or not you want to discuss it in your class, to say that Christopher Columbus was the first, you know, white man here is
Where he was
wrong.
going.
It's
Well, let's talk
wrong.
about that.
And he knew where he was going.
Right, yeah.
He had maps,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's a whole
Well,
history
there's
there.
more behind it. than that.
Phoenician maps, Templar maps,
Aerial
everybody
maps,
had
too.
aerial
In
maps.
Antarctica.
Yep.
There's reports in
Harry
India that they
Race.
were flying over here, you know, thousands of years ago. So, the legends of Quetzalcoatl, this winged plume serpent, is like a spirit of God who comes down and periodically animates a human. So Kent draws a short straw, and it's like, okay, you're gonna go down and you're gonna be Quetzalcoatl this time. It's like, oh man, they always get killed. Why me? Right? So Sayacatl is said to be the fourth incarnation of Quetzalcoatl. So hold that in the back of your mind. And he was driven out, and according to oral tradition, he stopped in Yucatan. They built the pyramid of Chichen Itza, is trying to establish something far enough away from the people of Yukmouth that he could leave a center there. And then the oral tradition states and some of the codices, the small amounts of writing that we have that the Spaniards burned, and I don't mean to pick on Spaniards,
Yeah,
but
I
it's a
know.
historical fact.
I have to study that. Mexico did a lot of this.
Yeah, so not, you know, if you were Roman, I'd find some way to.
Yeah, I know.
But you're here, and we're talking about this time and place, and
I don't
It-
believe that of you.
it wasn't the Norwegians.
No.
The Norwegians did not invade Mexico
I wish they were.
and wipe people out. So,
Somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
they when the Norwegians came, they were known, history knows them as the Vikings, and they were here to settle and trade, and they kind of mostly got along with most of the Native Americans they met. So, no, it wasn't.
They
the
were better.
Norwegians.
They were better, right?
That's fine.
May I recommend a film
Sure.
that kind of fits in with this
Yeah.
discussion? And I've recommended it to you guys before.
What is
We-
it?
It's
Can't
called
see
The
it.
Fountain
Oh yeah, that's fine.
by Darren Aronofsky with Rachel
Okay.
Weisz and
Excellent.
Hugh Jackman. And it's a love story, but it's time travel. And all kinds
Oh,
of
time
stuff.
travel.
okay.
We like that. So then, after doing all that, Quetzalcoatl, Sayacatl, leaves. He gets in a boat and he sails east across the ocean and says, I'll be back.
Mhm.
I will end this human sacrifice, yeah. And I don't know if that was his accent or not.
Now that's Arnold.
Oh, is that where I got that? When he left, the local legends acknowledged that Sayacatl was white-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. And so when Hernan Cortez arrives on the scene, some 500 years later, blonde, blue-eyed, white-skinned, that's why he was welcomed as the return of Quetzalcoatl, as predicted in the prophecies. So, roughly mid-900s, Sayacatl leaves. He's white-skinned 500 years before Columbus gets there, there is a lot of evidence all over the world of native indigenous peoples who were Caucasian.
What?
All over the world, Caucasian, white skinned.
Why?
Huh?
Right.
So we have white skinned people in Northern Europe, Northern Asia. There is a tribe called the Sami, who are nomadic reindeer herders up there in the polar regions. There's a tribe in in Japan that were there first, and when the people whose skin reminds us of Japanese now moved in, they drove them all the way up to the northern tip of Japan, and they were called the Ainu, A-I-N-U. There are reports, and they still exist, of people, different isolated tribes, like in the South American rainforest and in the Andes Mountains, small little pockets of white-skinned people who've always been there, always, in quotes. And there are reports of, buried in the middle of China, in a very inconvenient place if you're communist Chinese government, all the red-haired, white-skinned mummies that they have found.
Is that the Takamon Desert?
Yeah,
Mummies?
I didn't remember the name of the desert. I just remember seeing the pictures of the mummies in something I read 25 years ago. There are reports from North America of a large, tall, white race. One report says their name is the Anahuac.
How do you spell that place?
The desert,
No, Anahuac.
that's not a place, that's a people.
I know, how do you spell it?
Oh, I don't know if I know officially, but I would spell it A-N-A-W-A-K.
And I wrote an okay, so I don't know.
Flip a coin.
Or
You,
a
oh, okay.
CH, or who knows.
So these people were here and predated when the so-called Native Americans arrived, the darker skinned Native Americans. And according to oral tradition, there was combat between them, and the Anahuac were badly outnumbered and were possibly the source of some of the reputed remains that have been found here in North America of the 7, 8, 9 foot tall giants, as they're called sometimes. So almost every continent has something left in its original DNA of white-skinned people, and the notion that white man, quote unquote, wasn't here before Columbus got here is ludicrous with even a modest amount of research.
So I was just gonna mention the DNA evidence. I like to follow the DNA stuff mostly because it has kind of followed some of these legends, where we expect, like even, with France and Portugal and Spain, there's Andorra up in the mountains there, in the Pyrenees Mountains, that has a completely different DNA strain than all the countries around it. So it's, and then there's also a lot of legends that go along with that area as well. But the prevailing evidence so far out of the Native American, both, in North, South, and Central America, has basically shown that, especially in North America, that there is a very ancient link to Europe. So we're talking like 10,000 BC, but there's definitely that link, whereas more in Central and South America, you see a combination of African and Asian blood in there as well as the original, indigenous strains that they're looking at. So 10% of those that have been tested show the ancient European blood. And it is, a regional thing. But it's, so in other words, it still follows those legends.
Yeah.
May I
Of course.
chime in on the DNA note? I just came across information this past few days that among many other things, NASA has been engaged in a twin study, and that there's an astronaut who spent a year on the space shuttle, and we know about that. Well, he is a twin, and it has been revealed recently that at least 7% of his genes no longer match his brothers from his exposure to the
Identical
frequencies.
Yeah.
Identical twins.
Interesting, yeah.
Wow, that's
Um,
cool.
So these different cultures, there is an enigma in North America, and this is, again, has been suppressed over the years. There was a culture in the Mississippi River Valley, and Ohio River Valley, so basically roughly the eastern 1/3 to 1/2 of the United States and extending all the way up to the Great Lakes, of a culture that was known as the Mound Builders. They built pyramids, huge mounds, and most of which were earthen. There may have been some, I believe, that were stone, and most of them were destroyed to make farmlands, whatever. The area, it was interesting. I read about one, I want to say Louisiana, that the aerial view of it is a very detailed representation. The aerial view of this mound is about a 1/2 mile long. The mound is a 1/2 mile long. So 1/2 a mile, and the aerial view is of a human sperm cell laid out with the head, the little cap, and the little thing, and then the tail going like this.
How would they know that?
Yeah,
There's-
how would they know that?
There's more than one in southern France.
Right, so nowadays, some archaeologists, oh, well, we'll study over here, and this is a Hopewell culture, and we'll study over here, and this is the ABC culture.
And the Missouri.
And the notion
Yeah.
that is being suppressed is that there was a continent-wide advanced civilization. Just in the last 2 months, they've released the data they found down in the Yucatan that says, oh my goodness, there's hundreds of times more ruins here than we thought.
Advanced cities. and-
Advanced cities, complex.
Absolutely, yeah.
There is a history. I wonder who could have built them. Who would have had the knowledge to build them?
Jeez,
So
it might have been skilled artisans or
skilled artisans.
something. Nah,
What would we call them?
makers. Builders.
Well, aren't they finding that the tunnels and caves at the Four Corners area is even more massive than they've ever
Oh, I don't
let
know.
on? because
haven't
they've
heard
been
that,
They've been
but-
hiding military stuff down there.
Right.
So
I
it's
haven't
just
heard
now
that
coming out that
either, but I've
they
been
said it was
there.
this big and that it's much more vast, but
And that's where
they
the
buttoned it up.
the Hopi
hide stuff.
say
Right.
that they were down in that network, and then at one point they came back out.
Oh, I've got stories.
Basically, going back to the conspiracy thing, this is the first time in 10,000 years that we've had the technology to see things supposedly from above. So you have things like the Naztec lines, and even the roads coming out of Chaco Canyon show, that there's, this huge trade route of, roads that are coming in and out of there. And the one that kind of woke me up recently was, I follow some of the Phoenician work artistically, and not very many people study that. There's not a lot of information because they were a sea culture. So where did they live when they weren't at sea trading and doing different things? And it wasn't until, my guess is when Santorini went off and the Minoan culture and Malta and everything went down, that there was probably enough turmoil in the ocean there in the Mediterranean that they started to build their inland palaces. But that's the first time in the Mediterranean we really see palaces. And so I mentioned this a couple weeks ago about Andara, which I had never heard of until its destruction. But it was basically, there was a remnants of a Phoenician temple there. It was clearly Phoenician, very clear. But it also, and there was speculation that it was built in the recent speculation by the archaeologists that it was built in the same configuration as the Temple of Solomon. So you have all of these really interesting features, and then oh, guess what? Syria just blew it up. So it was gone. That's how I learned about it. It is in its passing, and within a few years, it will be dust. We'll completely forget about it. Some idiot just drove trucks across the Naztec lines.
The Nazca line.
And now, and then apparently, our president just signed something that's going to start encroaching onto Chaco Canyon. So these things that we can see now for ourselves, they aren't just mythology. They aren't just things that came down to us through, thousands of years of history. We didn't even hardly know about them, but now they're disappearing right and left.
They are destroying.
It's like the things that are going to prove some of this stuff that could only be seen from above for the first time in thousands of years, and now all of a sudden they're getting destroyed right and left.
Funny how
I-
industry
it's not-
does that.
I was watching the History Channel late at night once, and this archaeologist, scientist, whole bunch of titles like this long after his name. He wanted to find pyramids like the ones that the Toltecs built, or the Mayans, or whatever you want to call it, elsewhere. He said they're all over. So there's this one area in the United States that's a national forest. So he had all the credentials to go in there. The government wouldn't let him in. So what he did, he talked to a guy that had an airplane, got all the equipment needed to, like, it's not infrared, but it's something. Flew over low. Guess what? There's pyramids over in America that are Olmec. I mean, not Olmec, but Mayan, they said.
Right.
And I mean, they could see it, and they're all over. And also, they found the Mayan blue. They went to Ohio to get that color paint, and they had it tested, and it's 99.999999% accurate. That's where they got the paint.
Yeah, they got around a lot
Yeah.
more than historians think they did.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. The other thing that I just read, because I don't know if you know this, but on the Mayan pyramids, or in Mesoamerica, they have the flat top.
Mhm.
But it's believed that they actually had a pyramid on top made out of mica, which would be a conductor. Well, some of these, like the Hopewell cultures and such back east in North America, are known to have been trading huge amounts of mica. So what the heck do you need that much mica for if you're just, primitive Plains Indians?
Yeah.
There's
The-
definitely a connection.
Yeah, that is part of the Toltec tradition, that the tops of the pyramid had a room made out of mica. And where I'm going with all this is there's more than one way to find out information. And the Toltecs are known to have stored a lot of information in their artwork. And we've talked about that. You look at the art, you see a clue, it tells you how to access that with energy, and you receive feedback from the artwork itself. There's other traditions that state it's possible to actually store your, not just an impression about the artwork, but actual information. So the artwork is the history textbook if you know how to send the energy the right way. It's also possible to tap into these things, I guess you could say shamanically, through advanced high-level meditation techniques if you build your consciousness and do all this other work. In a lot of circles, it's described as tapping into the Akashic record. Whether you call it that or a shamanic method, and of course science, we don't go there, right? They don't acknowledge that that's possible or the data you get. But at the same time, our government uses these technologies, and for 50 years they've been using psychics in the military to do spying. The remote viewing programs, every branch of the military, the CIA, have all had their branches of this doing them. And they've found some amazing information out about the enemies. Of course, they're doing it to us. So it's a skill that can be learned.
There's, very recently, I heard someone discussing how when they were out there remote viewing, they would run into the Russians and say, oh, hey, how are you, bring you lunch, you know, and just pass each other in the hallways as they're going about their business. It was rather remarkable
Yeah, yeah.
concept,
The,
yeah.
the famous remote viewer that was so good that he could actually read text
Yes.
was murdered under suspicious circumstances
A
and
lot of
stuff
that
too.
kind of
I don't
stuff.
remember what the situation was, but like the top dog, they're
Ours or
close to
theirs?
ours
Got murdered. Okay.
in the United States.
Yeah.
under,
And that's common.
you know,
I'm not surprised. So those skills are real. They exist. This work, among other things, teaches you the control of and the mental discipline needed to learn that. So history is not what you think it is, right? This is one of my areas I've been studying for quite some time.
What they want you to know.
Right, is that we are, the Toltec view of the world, which matches the worldview of a number of different spiritual traditions, is that the world is an illusion. And there's layers upon layers upon layers upon that concept. So one is, yeah, this is illusion. This is all what we would describe as a holographic projection. The world was made out of chaos, you will read in some traditions, and that's exactly right. There's infinite amount of radiations and chaos out there, meaning right here. And what we have, and the Toltecs uniquely have, is the knowledge of how to use the assemblage point, that structure in our energy fields, that is at the same time both a lens and a filter. It functions like a projector. And then our biological machine in the central nervous system has the capability of functioning to make laser light. And then laser light is what's used to make holographs, those three-dimensional laser light projections. So these radiations come in through the assemblage point, they interact with us, and then we create this holographic projection. So that's one world of illusion. None of this is real. The chaos is real, and we filter down to how much of that we can handle. And each culture, each society kind of agrees on, well, the we don't go there stuff, so we'll leave that out, we'll crank that filter down. We're just gonna talk about all this nice, neat stuff over here, except somebody's always gonna go crank out, oh, look, over here. There's that famous medieval, maybe it's Renaissance artwork of the dome of heaven, and then the magician is looking out at
It's a
on the other side of the veil.
Why are you looking at me?
Because you're the art historian, I'm
It's a
expecting you to
woodcut.
know the artist and
It's
the
a
name.
cold
and-
art. I don't have it all memorized
Oh,
yet.
So anyway, so somebody's always gonna do that, and then word gets out, and then you have meeting groups like these Toltecs here. This is an illusion, right? Then the other layers of the illusion are like the brainwashing, the mind, oh, like, we don't go there in history. All the things that are suppressed, all the free energy devices, all the aircraft that were flying between Mesoamerica and India and elsewhere, up until very late, relatively speaking. And they were disguised as things like magic carpets. You read now and it's like, oh, well, you have this big levitating flat thing. It's a magic carpet. We'll call it a magic carpet. So the history, the true history of the Toltecs is something that we're still working to produce. And I don't expect a whole lot of help from the world of professional historians or archaeologists, maybe the archaeologists.
There's a lot of new work being done.
But there's new work, that's the key, there's new work being done, and what and the fatal flaw of professional academia is they don't talk to each other and they don't compare notes.
And it's kind of designed.
And so
that
we
way.
have to do that. We have to train ourselves to do that. And so there is a need here for this, because it's not just the who, what, when, where stuff. It's the why and the how that we want. And the true story. So we can reclaim our past, which will allow us to claim a future better than the one we see if you were foolish enough to watch mainstream media. And all the horrible world problems that are going on right now. We can create a new future. It takes waking people up, it takes raising our consciousness, it takes consciously learning how to tweak reality.
And we're doing it every minute.
Or tweak
We're
history,
doing it now.
the
Yeah.
so-called history, what they wrote.
Right, yeah, we have to alter the reality that's perceived by the masses.
When I came back in, you were talking about how you know there's these alternate realities and there's certain things that happen, but we just don't talk about those things. And I think politically in Americans especially, I kind of looking at it as airing our dirty laundry. There's a lot of stuff that's come up this last year that we just don't talk about. You know, the alt-right wingers and you know the just whatever, the homophobes, everything that's out there right now that is been happening in the closet or in the shadows or I mean, to be honest, I consider myself kind of worldly, and yet I've been shocked about some of the stuff that's come out of the closet over the last 2 years or so. But think about how long we haven't been talking about those things. And, you know, especially like even, let's just say the Nazi Germany thing. I mean, there's people today that believe that that never happened, or at least they choose to believe that that never happened.
Right.
And yet, you know, there's people alive that know that it happened. And yet, in a few more generations, you know, whoever's writing the history books are the ones that are going to tell that story or not. You know, there's so many things just because we've had so many advances in this last 100 years. There's things that used to be in the history books that just aren't there anymore because, oh, well, we've got all these other, you know, great, wonderful achievements that need to be in there. And so there is that, you know, things that just fall through the cracks, but there's also the witnessing of it and the bringing it forth, and that's kind of what's happening right now. And it's not a pleasant time, but it's kind of confronting our reality. And so I think in one way it's a good thing. Chaos is never fun, but sometimes when things get rigid and stagnant, they need to be ripped up a little bit.
I was watching this one show, and for example, it was about the Sphinx, and this one archaeologist said it's like 2,000 years older, and he proved it. And he said the whole thing is the historians don't want to rewrite the books and rewrite history.
Well, it's not 2,000 years old.
Well, I mean,
It's hundreds of thousands of years older.
yeah.
That was one that I had in my back of my mind as an example.
Yeah.
I ended up I wasn't going to bring it up, but you did. So now you're stuck getting some facts.
Yeah.
When they fully excavated the Sphinx, they found near the base water damage. And it's not water running over it, it's water lapping at it. And it creates a water line. And if you go over to Great Salt Lake, you go over here in the California-Oregon border to Lake Aberg, there's a couple hundred feet higher on the cliff, there's a water line where there was a long period of erosion where that was the water line, that was the lake level, and you can see it is etched into the cliffs. You can see it a mile away, more than 2 miles away. And that's the kind of water line that they have around the base of the Sphinx. So this geologist, I believe it's the same one you're talking about, has computed the actual elevation of this. He's gone over to other mountains in the area at the same exact elevation and found the same water line.
Right.
Now, everywhere else this water line exists, the general consensus among all the geologists is, oh, that's an erosion. Here's how old the rocks is. Here's how how much it's etched away. The water line was at that level 800,000 years ago.
Wow.
Almost a million years ago, the Sphinx was sitting there. 800,000 years.
Wow.
That Sphinx has been, it's older than the pyramids, it's
Right.
older than any other. So Jericho, 9,000 years, good for Jericho. Sphinx, 800,000 years. As
Well,
a,
that said, though, there's been a lot of changes in our how we date things, and that's the biggest issue. You know,
Mhm.
carbon dating is pretty much out, and when you're trying to date rocks, it's kind of difficult.
it
And so
uses
that's why
a
you
lot
know
of stuff.
some of the more recent dating is helpful, but I think the key point here is that the oldest stuff is the best stuff. So if you just look at the Great Pyramids, okay, they got that down perfect, but that was there when the pharaohs started. So
Who
How-
built
then
that?
who built those? Where
Yeah.
did they get that
Yeah.
technology, and why over time did they lose that technology and weren't able to create the same level of perfection?
And even the pyramid texts were saying in the earliest dynasties, we don't know what this means, but it's part of the formula, so we say it.
Right.
You know, it
Right.
goes way back.
So I think the biblical flood, Noah's flood in the Christian timeline. Yeah, there was definitely something happened at that period of time, but there was something beyond that. And I was reading the other Donnelly book. How do you say it? Ragnar.
It's
Ragnarok.
called Atlantis, the Destruction of Atlantis, Ragnarok, Age of Fire and Gravel. Ragnarok is an Icelandic deity that brought destruction. It is believed because it was a name for a comet that either collided with the Earth or had a very near miss, and we went through the tail of the comet.
So that's basically he goes through every culture, every continent, everything that's come down to us, and looked at those stories to support this idea of either a comet or the tail of a comet, pretty much hitting the Atlantic Ocean, shoving all that water up into the polar area, knocking us off our pendulum a little bit, and then, but basically what he's saying is there's a lot of things that potentially happen, and there's geological reasons that he presented for these theories, which there are theorists who still work with that concept, but that it was more of the impact cracking the crust of the earth and water from underwater tables coming up as a fountain. And when you read in the Bible, it doesn't say the water came down from the clouds, it says it came as a fountain from the ground. And then also simultaneous volcanic action. And if you see, like, we know for a fact by looking at the geology in southern Utah down into Arizona and Nevada and such, that you've got all of these layers. It's very clear that it was all underwater. It was like a huge, the Great Basin and Lake Bonneville. You can see these water level lines. You also, like in Zion's Canyon, there's 2,000-foot cliffs and carved by the river, and down at the bottom is where they find the dinosaur bones. So that means 2,000 feet worth of stuff was laid on top of those dinosaur bones at some point. And the top layer is a volcanic layer that they know and can date that it's 10,000 years ago. So technically, there's a lot of information that shows geologically what happened with some great cataclysm 10,000 years ago, but the stories that come down speak to that. And over and over and over again, he has quoted Toltec legend to talk about them. About, it was like, first it was all hot and fiery, and then it was all cold and wet, and then it was all muddy, and we all had to live in caves for a while. And some people decided when they came out of the caves that it was just too awful, so they went back and they lived in the earth after that, and just all sorts of things that just over and over and over tell the same story. And what's cool is that because he was referencing information from over 100 years ago, he's got all the Toltec stuff in there. I've never seen all of these references to Toltec, and so now we're going back and actually reading his reference sources and where he got that from. But the thing is clearly something big happened. It came down in our legends. If you've ever read the story of Gilgamesh, it completely parallels the story of Noah's flood and all of that. And so there's parallel stories that are saying the same thing. They're talking to this age before our age as to where we got our technology from and why we do the things that we do.
His reference to the Toltecs, they're one of the cultures in this book that refer to having come from Atlantis, and in this other book that describes the geological upheavals that caused the damage. The Toltec legends, the Toltec oral tradition, I think carries a lot of weight in my mind, and what we're trying to do is go find historical references or geological references or archaeological to try and piece this together, because when you go through all these books, we have the Popol Vuh is the so-called Mayan book of creation. We have, this is one of the history books that's just full of Toltec references on it. It's the one I'm going through now, The Ancient Kingdoms of Mexico. And I can't tell if that's Teotihuacan on the cover or not, and I don't think it says. But it's an odd.
Who's the author?
Davies, Nigel Davies. I'd never heard of him before, but we had the book kicking around. I bought it at a used bookstore years ago, and I'm finally using it. So the Toltec legends all state, whether they're Mayan legends about the Toltecs or the Aztec or any of the others, they all describe a culture that has pretty much the same capabilities. They were the artists, the artisans, the master builders. They could build the pyramids. They had all the sacred knowledge, and they were doing work with consciousness. So whether historians agree with that or not, in my mind, is irrelevant. I think there's things we can learn from archaeology and from history and anthropology and so on. But ultimately, the ultimate test in my mind is, are we going to be able to use all this knowledge for the benefit of humanity? That's where we go. So like the conspiracy theories are all true. If that is the case, what's next? We have to raise our consciousness. The Toltec methods are the best we have. We have to shine that light, as you said, and get the information out there through as many ways as possible.
Well, I think sorry.
Sharif first.
One question, in case it helps someone, I frequently ask myself is, what would have to be true for both of these things to be true?
Yeah, that's an excellent analytical
Say that
tool.
again.
It's a version of Hegelian dialectics maybe, but it's what if, okay, what would have to be true for both of these things to be true?
If you're analyzing two hypothetical situations, some people say a comet hit, other people say no, it didn't, but they each have a set of evidence. So what would be the scenario wherein all of it could be true?
And it gives you a place to start filtering and weeding and stuff. You know?
Kent, what were you going to say?
Well, just, you talk about how they were, the other big side of their work was working on consciousness, raising consciousness, I think. The big thing is you point out the conspiracy theories too, but a lot what's going on in the world, there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming and separating. That, along with that raising of consciousness, is being able to look at yourself, and you talk about, you started touching in on like your shadow self and, knowing your weaknesses and knowing what even your culture's weaknesses, can you actually, okay, admit that this is what's kind of been going on, but can you also turn back and see what your role in it's been, and
There's not a lot of that going on right now.
yeah,
It's all still in the finger pointing phase.
Not all, not that long.
Mostly.
A
There-
bulk, maybe,
It's,
yeah.
we're
Yeah.
we're
But a lot of
falling
people are waking
into
up every day.
the either or
Mhm.
premise,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
You know,
And
it's the you know, it's like the one. That's not a good analogy. Go ahead.
It seems like there's a greater separation happening now.
Mhm.
There's less people who are lukewarm and in the middle,
Mhm.
and they're either firmly taking the blue pill and they're gonna stay asleep and they're gonna defend their reality to their death,
Mhm.
or they're going to go through various stages of awakening with the red pill and seeing what's going on.
There's a
And so,
harvesting
but there, yeah, it's, I understand what you're saying, Cherie, because it's easy to focus on the negative
Mhm.
and not see the bright lights that, are popping open.
Yeah, I'm
and-
not trying to
yeah.
do all sweetness and light.
But,
That's
the
not what it
reality is that there's many people that are gonna go to their grave
Mhm.
asleep
Mhm.
and,
This time.
The
and there's not really a lot of time or energy to waste on that. In other words,
Too much
help who you
urgency.
can and then move on. And,
the trap they're falling into is, I often use the phrase, don't accept the premise of the question. So, do you want steak for dinner or do you want chicken? Well, what if the answer is neither or none of the above? I prefer lasagna tonight.
Or something else may
Yeah,
come.
right. So what
Both.
our culture has, and you must know this is being done deliberately.
Oh, yeah.
Go read George Orwell's book 1984 if you have any doubts.
It was a warning, not a how-to manual.
Yeah, I know.
Part of the problem.
But that idea of you're offered a simplistic choice, and this last presidential election was the worst I'd ever seen for having a very simplistic choice of, do you want the evil Republican or the evil Democrat? It's like,
A false
you
dichotomy.
got anybody else there, right?
anyway.
No, this country of ours, and that's the best two candidates you could trot out here for us to vote for? Really? It's,
Two-party system, it invites duality and.
Yeah, and
And proportional representation would help with that.
well,
Yeah.
even that concept is still
I know,
accepting the
we're
premise of the
moving
question.
forward, yeah.
And in terms of raising our consciousness, we have to learn how to think more critically.
As
And that-
individual sovereign.
Right. As the first step towards a greater role in the collective consciousness. Right? Everything we do as individual work on consciousness is still step one. Because almost no one individual is going to be able to inject a strong enough signal into the human collective consciousness to change everybody else. It happens. You get some people who have the charisma or the knack. I would put Elon Musk in this category, but even he is still playing the game, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He's launching these highly sophisticated rockets based on last century technology.
He's not even using Tesla technology.
Right. So does he know about it? Well,
He must.
right? But still, we have it. It's rare. You count up the Elon Musks of the world. Every once in a while, there's a little shift, and you get like famous musicians having an impact, like the Beatles, right? So let's kill John Lennon. He wrote all their lyrics, right? Peace
let's
and love
spy on
and
him
goodwill to a
first.
fellow man. So there's that false illusion
Mhm.
that we have no control over the world. The Toltec work is moving us in the direction of changing that belief. And it is partly by analyzing our history that we're going to help other people embrace that. So I think next week what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about some of the history in more detail. Some of the Toltec cities, some of the Toltec sites, and a few more of the theories about how far they spread, what did they do. There's a few other things I want to bring out into discussion about that. And at that point, I want to start also talking more about the relationship of the Toltecs, especially to the Mayans. I've introduced the vague general category of the early, middle, and late Mayans and how a lot of that was really Toltecs. I want to look at that in a little more detail. Question?
Just trying to tie a few of these concepts together. Some of the books on the reading list are older books. And I guess what we're saying, both having, graduate degrees and all that, some of the best stuff is in the older books, that it hasn't been messed with quite as much. And so it's a difficult writing style, and you need to realize that when they were writing about controversial subjects, they were, putting their academic, reputation on the line, and that they argue their points in that kind of way to, logically lay out their arguments and everything.
Right.
But I think, when we're talking about possibly channeling new information and bringing new insights into these kind of discussions, we have to trust our intuition. And it was, I don't even know how many years ago, probably at least almost 15 years ago, that I just ran across an old book. It was called Gods, Graves, and Scholars. And in there, it was a bunch of really interesting stories, and that's where I first read about Heinrich Schliemann finding the city of Troy. And the thing about that story is that he went strictly off the legends. All the academics said that it was mythology, that Troy didn't exist. It was, made up by the Greeks. And he said, oh yeah, and he just read it, and he said, okay, well, you go over to this tree and over to this mountain, past this river, and there you'll find Troy. And he found it right where the legend said it would be. And so we have examples of these, and they're rare, because if the academic doesn't want to put their reputation on the line, and the amateur doesn't have the funding and the backing to go off and do these things. And I think in one way, we're kind of being called as witnesses to see what exists now in our time, and to say, no, I was there, I saw it, it exists, so it's not just, oh, I heard about this place. But I wanted to really quickly just tell you some of my background with my graduate degree, because I was working at the Utah Shakespearean Festival, and I was kind of an amateur in Celtic mythology and so forth. And I was involved in several productions where the director had said he wanted to do the play in the Celtic style. And Celtic was becoming very popular, with the New Age movement and stuff at the time. And I felt like the designers weren't really coming back with anything realistic, that they were bringing back kind of like Dark Age looking stuff, furs and, everything looking gory and gross and all that. And it's like, okay, the Celts believed that this world and the other world were the same, that there was no difference. They were fearless warriors because they weren't afraid of dying, because there is no difference. They decorated every single thing they had with this knotwork design, the endless knot, to show that there is no difference between this world and the next. Their swords, their armors, their chariots, their everything, spoons, pots, everything have this knotwork on it to remind them of that. So why would they be wearing ragged furs and stuff and not have any modern technology? So when I started looking into it as the basis of my graduate work, I found that we know things up on the academic level, but they don't filter down into the history books. So I can tell you right now that all of our art history and all of our costume history books are horribly out of date, and they show this old model of east to west technology, that anything cool happened in the Near East, and it filtered up to us poor barbarians in the north at some point, and we got a clue at some point. When in fact, you know, we were contemporary with the Greeks and the Romans and even cultures prior to that. That we were using their language to create secret languages that they couldn't read. And yet we were spoken of as being barbarians and illiterate and being prehistoric because we didn't have a written language as far as the scholars understood. To do my research, I had to look at secondary and tertiary evidence. I had to look at what the Greeks and the Romans said about the Celts. Well, history is always going to be biased. The Romans are always going to say they won the battle, and if they lost, it was because, oh, they were big brutes and they, you know, didn't play fair or something. So the information comes down incorrectly. But one of the things that the scientists were saying about the legend says that the Celtic kings and queens had beautiful colored clothing and that they had silk. Okay, so as a costume designer, I'm like, okay, that's the way it should be. So why are we putting them in furs and you know, this gross medieval looking stuff? Well, the scientists are saying, well, there's no way that they could have had silk in Northern Europe. Well, it was, you know, 500 years before the Silk Roads opened up through the Middle East and such. Well, it's really super clear after going to Europe and doing my research there that there was northern trade routes between China and Northern Europe. They did, in fact, have silk. And not only did they have, you know, silk that was more natural, had schlubs and things in it. It wasn't as fine as the Oriental silk. They actually had Oriental silk that they unwove and rewove into their own Nordic designs. And they were capable of, in the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago, we have fragments of fabric that, you know, is thin and uniform and, you know, beautifully decorated and such. So it's simply that this information has not filtered down into our current textbooks. And it's
Great
clear
point,
that if you go and do the research yourself, that you'll find things out. And the biggest thing that I found by doing this research is this idea, one, that the east to west model is incorrect, and two, that we had much more technology even in these eras that we consider to be primitive. My first case study was the Iceman. He's the oldest body that we found that has all of his clothing and his skin, so that we could see he had tattoos that align with the acupuncture meridians points. And my big thing as a costume designer was he had leather underwear on. Well, if I was going to be designing a cave guy, I wouldn't put leather underwear on him. I wouldn't even have thought about that. So he had, you know, like a fanny pack with medicinal stuff in it, and you know, so I studied a lot of anthropology in my studies because that's where the clothing was going to be. I studied the bog bodies and the Takhmon desert mummies, you know, where China doesn't. I mean, they clearly repressed the idea that anyone Caucasian ever made it to Asia before certain dates. And yet we have these whole collection of mummies that are clearly Caucasian, which they've suppressed the information on. But, you know, we have copies of it, but we don't get to go and look at them
So they
anymore.
altered history.
Yeah, so they just erase things from history. And I think that's the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, any conquering group is going to completely wipe out the
Yeah.
history of the group before them.
Yeah.
And
the
so
art.
and so that, yeah, and I mean that's why you have the faces and everything that are ripped off of, you know, statues and things. And yet, you know, we get, and we don't understand then why you know, there's this, and that's all a conspiracy as far as I'm concerned, but you have this one outing that happened down in the South, and with the right-wing Nazi, you know, white supremacists coming out. And guess what? The next day, all the Confederate statues are gone. Now, you can't tell me that that wasn't pre-planned. Okay, so we're like, okay, we have an issue. We've got these Confederate statues. What are we going to do about them?
Just stop
And
cleaning
so
them
let's
to
just
prisons.
have this little issue that happens, and then in relationship to that issue, some girl gets killed, and so now we're going to go out and take all these statues down in the middle of the night because 2 days later they were all gone. so that there's not gonna be this firestorm of hatred and things that happen. I mean, that, we got off light with that one compared to how other civilizations have been decimated, by the conquering heroes. So it's, it's clear that there's a cover up. There's clear that academics don't like to talk to each other. I really wanted to do my PhD in Celtic studies, and there was only like 5 PhD programs in the world, and one of them was at Harvard, and I didn't quite figured I was a Harvard kind of girl. The other one was down in New Zealand, and the other ones are all in Britain. But when I would have had to choose between hardcore archaeology, hardcore history, or literature, and it was clear that the 3 groups did not talk to each other. They weren't coming up with a common consensus on who the Celts were and how they lived, even though they each had a part of that puzzle, and they could easily have put it together and said, well, the legends say there was silk, and the historians say, well, there's no way it could be because the Silk Roads weren't open. But then the archaeologists could pipe in and say, well, we're finding bodies that have silk on them. So, it was that easy, but they don't go there. They don't, they're going to defend their point of view, even if it's inaccurate and it causes confusion.
And so that's the level of analysis we need to bring to the study of the Toltecs, right? We are going to go through, we want to present some of this information and look at what archaeology says, look at what history says, look at what all these different sources say. We have a lot of what the Aztecs said. We have some of what the Mayans said. And we have what the Toltecs say, because we're still here. We have the oral tradition.
I would just love to say that I faced the same dilemma, and I went with literature.
Good
So
for you.
somebody had to,
Right.
and I got just enough to get some formal groundwork and see what was wrong with the field and shoot,
Kind of tying a few things up here, that Michael Tellinger guy that you guys
Yes.
turned me on to. I was watching his program. He's really positive and forward thinking, like trying to actually get a message of what we can do to make the world a better place. But got his start doing his own research on the stone circles in Africa. And, same thing. They're saying they're there to store cattle, yet there's no entrances to them. They're these big rock mounds with no entrances. But his consensus is that these researchers are all in that they think the power elite and the ruling power of the planet is in its death row, that it's in panic mode. And even this researcher who's spent the first 20 years of his career going after NASA for faking images and purposely distorting them is now changing his tune, because NASA even appears to be almost kind of usurping the throne of the secret space program and doing really crazy stuff, like putting out old analog images of structures on the moon and Mars inside of a pack of digital images from current stuff, and oh, that got in there by accident. We accidentally got the file slipped up, and they're like, how do you accidentally slip an analog image into a pile
Or
of digital images?
An individual at NASA
Yeah.
has done it.
There are factions and parties all everywhere. Michael Tellinger, The Cattle Crawl, there's in one of his documentaries, and I'm trying to go back and find where it is, there's a video that includes footage of aerial or satellite photography of the Amazon, where they've been clearing and stuff, identical structures all through the Amazon.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
How can we, as Toltec warriors, disrupt the historians and rock the boat and challenge them to get the potential of the Toltecs out there?
The planets in our solar system are all orbiting the sun. They spin. Right now we're on the dark side. Tomorrow morning we'll turn back around and we'll face the light side. and you get arguments. Is the earth flat? Is it round? Blah, blah, blah. There's all this information, and oh, don't look over here. I went up in an airplane, I saw a horizontal line, therefore the earth is flat. You know, zoom out, of course, there's the round pictures. The sun doesn't care about any of that.
Mhm.
It's just radiating its brightness outward.
Right,
And that's kind of what we have to do.
okay.
We have to just radiate brightness outward. So I can't remember when it was. I think it was last fall. We were at a trade show and spreading the Akadwa energy. And there's this whole notion of the theory of subtle energies versus the actual practice. And I showed the energy to someone. Oh my. And then they know, right? So we just have to keep doing that. There's another old adage that says, never wrestle a pig in the mud. You both just get dirty and the pig enjoys it. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to wrestle the pigs in the mud. We just have to keep stating our position and the evidence for it. And then we have to keep using the Akadwa, and pretty soon there will be enough people using the Akadwa, and there will be enough people affecting the human collective consciousness. And small groups work best. We're almost big enough to be a small group here. This has been a long time coming.
Mhm.
Our lineage has been planning this for over 1,000 years. And the best way we can help wake up all the population, the total percentage of the population who's capable of being awakened, is to do what I often tell you, I think every one of you's heard this, is do good, avoid evil, right? We keep doing our work. We keep doing our Toltec work on ourselves, our Toltec work on our group. We keep speaking a truth. And we keep shining this innermost light. And those who are capable will wake up, and those who aren't will get left behind. And we have to be okay with the fact that some are going to get left behind.
Right.
And you have to be okay if some of the ones who get left behind are your close friends and family.
Right.
Right, okay.
Free will.
It's a free will universe, and if you look at all the evidence and you still believe the Earth is flat, this has come up recently, the whole flat Earth thing. Because
We have nothing better to talk
And
about,
it's
right?
just sailing around.
this is important.
Yes, it is.
No, I
This
mean,
is-
in the
no,
world.
stop. It's important because it's a test case by the people who are doing the brainwashing to see where they're at.
Oh.
They want to see how effective they've gotten at when they release disinformation as to who buys it,
Right.
who believes that the world is flat.
Yeah.
You're getting celebrities going on, like I don't own a television that I can watch TV on, but I see the clips on the internet. This celebrity says the earth is flat, right? Oh, and they have some impassionate story, whether they're a musician or an actor or something. They have this notion that the earth is flat, and because they're famous and people see them in People magazine and the National Enquirer, they believe them, right? Without any facts. So what percentage of people are buying this now? It's going to go away at some point this year. And it's going to come back in about 2 years
But
as a
I'm
test
getting-
case to see who believes it then.
Are they now saying that the Earth is no?
Yeah, there's a
What?
big,
There's a
yeah,
group-
that's
there's a
what I
group of
said last
people
year when it
saying
came
that,
up.
yeah.
It started coming up about a year ago, not quite a
Yeah.
year ago. There's a big movement
I never
out
heard
there.
It's bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
That. I
Of-
never heard that.
it's
Of-
been happening for a couple of years.
Mostly about a year, but
Yeah.
it was.
And where? Because I didn't, and I have a not in my house, but I
It's
live
the-
in a house that is a
It comes
television.
out on the news
YouTube.
or
It's coming out on the news, it's coming out in magazines, it's
Yeah.
coming
The
out
last
on the
6
internet
months,
channels.
scientists
They have
say that the
conferences,
earth is
everything.
flat.
No.
Yeah, we
Okay,
can't
That's
actually
always
find
nice
a
when
scientist who
scientists
says that,
say it.
Yeah.
but that, the headline says scientists now agree the earth is, and so they're,
Yeah, they believe
So
heaven
do
and
I.
hell is like outside of a rock wall that surrounds us and stuff. Like you can actually get to hell physically from the earth by sailing around the walls. It's
yeah, so
wild, very wild.
I have a picture that I post periodically. It's a picture of the full moon with a horizontal black stripe going across it. And the caption reads, "Those flat earth eclipses are awesome." And if you want it, let me know, I'll email it.
Yeah,
Um,
let's get it in the
So,
Inquirer.
that's- That's the kind of stuff that's being done.
Mhm.
When you are on Facebook and you see those quizzes, what kind of a this would you be? What kind of a that would you be? Can we guess your educational level by these 14 questions?
It's clickbait.
No. No, no,
It's
no,
fogging.
no. Yeah, you click on the page, there's
Yeah, I know,
ads,
I mean,
right?
there's.
And that- but
often
that's not what
something
it
to
is.
But
That's
there's-
data gathering for
Finding?
psychological profiling.
That's what I
That's what
thought too.
where I was going with clickbait, yes,
They
that's the
they
deeper
want you
layer.
to do that, and it's not just collecting population-wide demographic information. They want information about you specifically. Your hardware,
are
you have a
you?
unique hardware address on your computer. They know it's you.
Mhm.
So don't take any of those quizzes.
I don't,
It's
There
very
was a time-
specific
no.
in an intent to psychologically analyze you so that in any circumstance they know what you're going to do and they know where to find you.
It's creepy.
So that's the evil I tell you to avoid.
Mhm. No, that's
And what's the next thing I tell you?
Shine.
Too good.
No,
Do good.
do good,
Good.
avoid evil, and if you can't avoid it, kick its rear end.
Kick.
But you can't do any of that if you kick it in the butt.
The culo.
With your sharp-toed boots.
With steel.
But you can't do any of that if you aren't aware and awake and using your discernment and using your attention. Whenever you sit down at the internet, you better have your attention body cranked up. Right? You crank it up, you extend your fields of attention, and you look in them. This is one I've learned really well the last year or so. And it's important.
They are very, very.
You will start all of a sudden
Violent.
having strong intuitive hits on the meaning behind what you're seeing. You have to extend your fields and ask the question when you're watching the internet.
When I'm watching YouTube, before I even turn it on, I set an intention.
Yeah.
And it always gives me exactly what I need.
What do you
There
say?
might be a 2-hour video, but there's 5 minutes of gold in it, whatever, but
Yeah.
everything slips into place and it's there for me.
So,
It's
yes,
Intention and attention.
there's stuff going on out there. Many of the conspiracy theories are probably true.
Or are
we-
built on a nugget of truth.
Yeah, we have to rise above that. We have to, okay, but if true, then what? And the what is wake up. Okay? You can't wake anybody else up if you're not awake. So continue to wake yourself up, continue to raise your consciousness. And so this analysis of the Toltec history, how some of it's been suppressed and what is true, that's what we're going to be exploring for at least the next couple of times.
Cool.
Any other
Yay.
questions?
Happy guest
Yeah.
coming next
We
week.
got a comment from a viewer that says mica was used to protect against harmful rays of the sun. Author Maurice Cotterell tells of how birth goddesses of South America were housed underground with the walls lined with mica.
Who made the comment?
Maria.
Maria. Oh, I know Maria. Hi, Maria. That's part of it. Yes. Mica is also a very potent semiconductor, electrically speaking. It's not a strong conductor. It's not a strong insulator. It's in that intermediate stage that we call semiconductors, which is the same electrical property that we have in silicon chips in computers. And it was used on the tops of the pyramids as a kind of a concentrator for the energies that the pyramids generate. And it's sort of like a conduit on steroids, if you want to think of it that way. When you went in these chambers, that energy would then affect you in a way that accelerated some of this work. Now, you had to be ready to go in there. Okay? You didn't just, on
Otherwise
day
you-
one of Toltec school, they didn't throw you in there unless they didn't like you. But yeah, that's another reason it was used, is because it,
Maybe if you got Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego with you.
There you go.
Yeah.
Set it up.
Venture into that fiery furnace.
yeah. Well, they had help.
Yes. I know.
They had a
It's an
little bit of
angel.
help.
Is Mica the green one?
No, it's kind of a,
Silver
well, it
glass.
might, it's
Silvery
kind of a,
white, papery looking
it's
layers.
thin
laminated.
flakes.
Yeah, it's laminated.
It's usually goldish, maybe a hint of green to it. And
Are you
it
looking it
can
up?
separate off in big flakes.
So are people ingesting this? Cause
No, no, no.
I've seen people selling it, I've had people contact me from different places and,
Mica?
yeah. Like they have
It might
pictures
be,
of it,
yeah.
just tons and tons of it, I didn't even know what it was until now.
Probably a new cult phenomenon.
Yeah,
They're probably
almost-
snorting it.
Like-
Are these the same,
Oh, here it is.
are these the same people who are telling you to eat Tide Pods?
No, I didn't know what it was for, it just, it shows it like it's almost like tablets or something, the way that they have it packaged,
comes
so
in
I
different
didn't know what it
colors.
was.
Oh, it does,
So
okay.
it's like a stone
It's
almost,
like
like,
a
it
bit
is
of
a
rock.
rock, okay.
Yeah.
I used to do a lot of rock collecting when I was a kid. I think I got my start for some merit badge
Yeah,
or
this,
something.
this
It's
one
sort
is
of
the one I think
semi-soft
of.
on the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
Can I see
how do
what
I
it
make
looks
it go back? I touched it.
Yeah, that triangle. It's
So
like
this is
so-
the one I thought that I was thinking of. It's just like a shiny, slivery stone,
Oh, it's pretty.
but apparently
a
it comes in
plant.
different colors.
Yeah, this
Thank
one
you
down
for
at the
looking
bottom
it
is,
up.
It's kinda what I was
like, what is this thing there? What they mean with
And it does smell profuse. And
um,
the seed pod is kind of silver.
Thank you, sweetie.
looking, and it
Just
looks
a
lot
tidbit,
like-
you talk about the pyramids and talking about
And there's
the lines
another
on the
one
ocean.
that's-
I always
yeah,
thought that was
really
interesting
flat.
when they talked about, you know, they got the hieroglyph of what looks like
Um,
someone's holding a giant
Very
light
different
bulb
mold
in the
dividers,
pyramid
tip
and that
yeah,
there's no soot
type.
from any kind of
Right.
fire burning
Yes.
or
No.
torch carrying
Like
that's
Mica
in
is
the
formed,
Great
yeah,
Pyramid. So they obviously had something
Yeah.
to light.
Right. They had electric light bulbs.
But yeah, but it wasn't torches. So.
Right.
Yeah, they use batteries, huh?
Or-
Here's that is being used like isolator, like electrical isolator.
Yeah.
It means electrical isolator.
It's,
What's that mean?
So
well, it's not a great insulator. It's a semiconductor and it helps store charge. So when the top of the pyramid that comes up and it's almost a point, but then flattens off, it used to go up to a point, but the upper part was hollow and the walls of that upper part, which are like a little mini pyramid, were made of mica.
to keep the energy of the pyramid there and not
Right.
coming out, you mean?
Right.
So
Or
people
to
will
have
go in that place?
Or to have someone be in that space and be activated or receive, a transmission from being in there.
But
Yeah.
from
Yeah,
the energy they will receive is from inside.
Yes.
Because if it is isolator,
Insulate-
insulator,
insulator.
thank you.
Insulator.
If it is insulator, electrical insulator means like once insulate is the energy, keep it from going outside, no?
Some of it. It's,
Or from the energy
from
from the
going
outside
in.
put it in.
Yeah.
Both.
So
Yeah.
it means
Oh,
like
like
it will
hot or
store the
cold.
energy of the pyramid within. Right, okay.
Yeah,
Also
there's a whole technology about
sun
pyramid
and stuff.
science, and you know, because we have a lot of people up in Mount Shasta building them out of
Yeah, there's,
copper and so forth. But there's
Okay.
different spaces within the pyramid that are more resonating, and they call them, like in the Great Pyramids, like the King's Chamber
And the Queen's
and
Chamber.
the Queen's
and-
Chamber. There's so like if you were to build a giant greenhouse, there would be some place up in the middle of there that was the ultimate place where your plants would grow the best, as opposed to growing them anywhere in there, which is going to be better. But yeah, it's energy going both directions. But that's part of the reason, like we use that in this altar configuration, because the pyramid has some really super special properties. But when you think about the technology of pyramid building and the fact that there's pyramids all over the world, I don't know how many of you have read or studied about the Bosnian pyramid. It's supposed to be one
Very
of the biggest
interesting
ones.
stuff.
But you know,
That's
there's these
right.
configurations all over. But look at all of these temples that we've just found recently in Mesoamerica. I mean, the place was a parking lot. It was a metropolis, and it's covered and reclaimed by the jungle. But the more they clear the jungle away, the more pyramids they find, and they're everywhere. So there's something really sacred about that configuration and the movement of energy.
yeah, it's funny that it appears now.
Oh no, all the secrets have to be revealed in the end. Yeah.
The sad thing about clearing that much jungle though is that the nutrients through that land aren't in the soil, they're in the canopy
Yeah.
and everything in between. It's a community that's very dense and complex and nutrient rich. So,
Any other questions?
Just talking about how they remove faces and stuff from statues earlier. There was a guy that I think's pretty funny. He was writing about in the Vatican. He's like, you know, that there's a closet that has all the dicks in it.
I was gonna say.
And they chiseled off all the penises when they went through the whole sexual repression.
Yeah.
And so he's like, yeah, somewhere in the Vatican there's a whole closet full of stone dicks. So. I thought that was-
Okay,
What
on
were we
that
talking
note,
about earlier, Yvonne? We were passing Dick's
All right.
Sporting Goods.
thank you all for tuning in. We are done, and we'll see you next week.
Oh.
Yay, that was
Thank
so
you.
fun. Oh, thank you.
Stone